what kind of take are we going to have on this particular story? The angles, though, are actually hooked up to the facts. So we can only say a game is a blowout if the score and the difference, the margin of difference between the two scores, is such that we hit a threshold. So 10-2 is pretty much a blowout, except, by the way, in Little League, where you never say the word blowout because it will depress the children. So we figure out what's the angle on this story, and actually not a single angle, but the multiple angles on this story. And the angles actually know about each other. That is, the fact that the game one side won will be an angle. There was a winner. The fact that it was a blowout is also another angle. But blowout is able to say, you know, I'm more interesting than just saying one side won or another side won. If I have a particular player who actually did a great job, right, that if a heroic batting performance, that player, right, will be identified as the heroic batting performance player, and that will be an angle. And it will percolate to the top because of its importance, its interestingness. So at the end of this process, where we're running all these tests on these angles, we have a representation of what happened at a fairly domain-specific, at a fairly, in a fairly abstract way. It's a representation of the events that are the important events and ordered by whether or not they're more or less important. At that point, we ask ourselves, what kind of story am I going to write? Am I going to write a full story describing this game? Am I going to be writing a small alert having to do with the stock? Am I going to have a tweet that's associated with what the traffic in a particular metro area is doing in terms of sales, real estate sales? We ask that question, and that turns into the structure of the story. And then each of the elements of the structure says, get me the angles that actually fit my structure. I've got the lead. What's the most important angle in terms of this story? I've got the nut graph. What are the three things that anyone who is reading the story needs to know? Feeds back into the angles and structures the story. Then we actually have a story. We have no language, though, yet. And at that final moment, we hit that last little run where we apply language to it and we end up with the narrative. So from data to facts to angles to structure to narrative. So whenever we look at a new content type, whenever we have a new client and they say, well, you know, we want a story, for example, I mean, in real estate, we want a story about new home sales for all these metro areas. And we want that story to be, have year-to-year comparisons, have month-to-month comparisons, have comparisons between metro areas. The first question we always ask is, what's the data? Do you have data that actually supports this story that you want to tell? And if you have it, that's great. If you don't have it but it exists, we'll find it, we'll get it. But it always starts with, is the story supported by data, and where is that data? Then we ask the question, what kinds of analysis do you do? What do you derive from this data? Do you care about year-to-year analysis? So we have to do comparisons there. Is there seasonal adjustment that has to be taken into account when we're actually writing this story? And that turns into our derivations. And then we ask, okay, what's the angle? What kind of story do you want? Do you want this to be a story that is about new home sales? Do you want it to be a story about home sales in general? Do you want to really have a story about foreclosure sales? What kind of stories do you want in terms of the take on the story? And then, how's the story structured? Like, what kind of form do you want it? Do you want an abstract? Do you want a full-tilt story? Do you want a tweet? Do you want something slightly in between? And at the end of the day, how do you say it? And here we work intimately with our clients' editorial teams. Because our goal is not to actually write stories that are a reflection of our point of view, our analysis, or our language. What we want to do is we want to write stories that actually fit our client's voice, fit our client's form, fit our client's understanding of their audience. And so a lot of the work that we do is really about trying to capture the tone, the feel, the language that a client uses. So this company rose up out of, as Stuart mentioned last night, rose up out of a partnership between engineering and journalism, engineering and editorial, because in fact we've sort of moved beyond just journalism now. And that partnership really came about because we were running classes where we had joint projects between our engineers and our journalists, and we would give them problems. And this happened to be one of the problems that we gave them. That is, let's write some stories from data. We'd been writing stories from other things in the past, primarily built on a substrate of search. But we decided to actually start looking at how to write a story built upon a substrate of data analytics. And this leads to an interesting situation in that the company is, in terms of staffing, is about 2/3 engineers and 1/3 writers. And those writers actually build the configurations for every new system that we come up with. The engineers actually work on the core platform and the end-to-end of getting the data in and delivering the content out. But the writers are what gives the system voice. Not by writing it themselves, but by meta-writing, by saying, here's what a story should look like, and here's how to communicate it to the machine. This adds to, this creates an interesting problem for us. And that from an engineer's perspective, they want this. I'm hoping that for most of you, who here knows YAML? Okay, one. Congratulations. YAML stands for a lot of things. One of the things it stands for is yet another markup language. My favorite thing about YAML is that there's a difference in YAML between 4 spaces and a tab that actually has semantic differences. That means that you have differences in a file which are invisible to the human eye that editorial should have to deal with. Engineers love this. Editorial, not so much so. So what we thought was, let's actually start thinking about what would it mean for editorial to be given a tool that actually reflects the way they do things from a writer's perspective. And so we built a tool for them that allows them to do things in a way that actually makes sense to them. And this is an internal tool that we call Pilot. And it allows them to say, I want to write first an outline. I want to tell you what the overall structure of the story is. And this is a very simple outline where we've got a headline, the topic lead, and then an overview. And then from there, we say, OK, these bigger elements actually break down into all these little smaller elements.